Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. You might have heard of the name Donald McNeil. He was the chief COVID reporter for the New York Times during the COVID pandemic. Normally, we don't pay much attention to what a New York Times reporter has to say about anything, but in this case, there was something which caught our attention. In trying to explain the New York Times' role in covering up the lab origin or in not reporting about it, McNeil now claims he was misled by Fauci's scientists. You see, the cover-up had nothing to do with false narratives. It was just that the New York Times was duped. Everyone was duped. How convenient. In today's show, we're going to investigate whether the media was really duped or whether they just didn't want to report the truth. Time is finally beginning to run out for the COVID origin hoaxers. For the first time in these past 4 years, there will be a bipartisan Senate investigation which will look into the origin of the COVID virus. Now, we're not sold on that, given that the investigations so far have been so disastrous. For instance, the Republican-led COVID Select Committee investigation into COVID's origin still hasn't published any of the interviews it conducted over the course of the past year, and it has also not subpoenaed key people and documents. But perhaps this time will be different. We shall see. What the new investigation appears to have triggered is preemptive defensive moves on the part of the media, which played such an important role in promoting the COVID origin hoax and in protecting the cabal of Fauci-funded scientists who were pushing the hoax. Those defensive moves are very similar to what we saw in the Russiagate saga, where years later journalists like Michael Isikoff claimed that they were duped by Christopher Steele. But do these excuses have any credibility in the case of COVID's origin? First off, Donald McNeil, who was the New York Times' veteran science reporter during COVID, is all the things you'd expect from a New York Times reporter. He blamed Trump. He praised China. He blamed misinformation. He cheerled for the WHO. And of course, we can't leave out Fauci, who was given a huge platform to trash Trump. So all that is par for the course. But what about the Wuhan lab leak? Well, McNeil now claims that he was duped by Fauci-funded scientists, and that is why he dismissed the lab leak theory. This is what McNeil says in his new book. It's one thing to be lied to by a politician and fail to check it out, but on viral evolution, to whom do you go for a second opinion? So in a nutshell, he's trying to tell us that when it comes to viruses, the only people on Earth who know anything about that are a tiny group of Fauci acolytes, and since those acolytes lied to the New York Times, there was no lab leak reporting. Let's start with the fact that, indeed, there was no lab leak reporting. Early in the pandemic, McNeil wrote an article dismissing the lab leak theory, but it wasn't published because the New York Times decided they didn't want to give oxygen to the lab leak theory, even negative oxygen in terms of talking about it at all. In other words, the New York Times was arguably even worse than the rest of the media, which is saying something. Now, it is true that when McNeil wrote his article for the New York Times, he did consult Fauci's gang of proximal origin hoaxers. That means the group led by Fauci-funded scientist Christian Anderson, who wrote a phony paper dismissing the lab leak theory at Fauci's behest. At the time of writing their phony paper, Anderson and at least one other proximal origin author had huge pending grant applications sitting on Fauci's desk. If the New York Times had done even just elementary journalism, they would have easily uncovered those conflicts of interest by checking the public grants record. But let's leave that aside. So McNeil is now claiming that he and the New York Times got duped by Anderson and the other proximal origin authors. Is that correct? Well, they have one thing going for them, which is that Fauci's little group of proximal origin author scientists did indeed lie to McNeil. We know this because they congratulated themselves for doing so, And they did that in private messages which were accidentally disclosed by Republicans last year. If you're wondering why Republicans did not voluntarily release those messages and how we came to know about them, we did a show on that story last year. Those were the messages where the same people who wrote in the Proximal Origin article that a lab leak was not possible were privately saying that a lab leak was so friggin' likely. It is because of those messages that we know that at least two of the Proximal Origin authors, Anderson and another guy called Robert Gary, really did try to mislead McNeil and the New York Times. That part is true. McNeil had sent them questions about whether the virus came out of a lab, noting that he had heard that the White House was involved because it was a national security issue. Gary privately told the chat group, which comprised the four original Proximal Origin authors, that means Anderson, Gary, and then two people called Eddie Holmes and Andrew Rambeau. Well, Gary told the group that like any reporter, McNeil could be misled. Anderson then replied to the group and said that McNeil had nailed it, meaning that McNeil was right about the lab leak and about the national security concern. But Anderson told the group that they were not going to tell McNeil that he was right. Instead, Anderson feigned ignorance, claiming that he was just a humble scientist whose life was totally unexciting, no lab leak and no national security issues. Anderson then bragged to the private chat group about how he had misled McNeil, even pointing out that he'd used a smiley face to make everything look super innocent. Anderson ended by telling the group that I really, expletive, wished my life wasn't this exciting. So what Anderson told the Proximal Origin group was the exact opposite of what he told McNeil. Does that mean that McNeil is absolved and the New York Times is absolved? No, far from it. Yes, they were lied to, but did they report that they were lied to? Of course not. The private messages have been out for almost a year, and there hasn't been a peep about it from the New York Times. How's it possible that the New York Times was duped by a group of Fauci-funded scientists, but then, when all the evidence came out, they concealed the fact that they were duped? How can we take McNeil's claim of being duped seriously when the New York Times refuses to tell its readers that their reporter was lied to? But there's more. It wasn't just that the New York Times concealed the private messages when they were released last year. In 2021, the Diffuse proposal for making COVID in a lab, in the Wuhan lab to be precise, was leaked. It was a giant smoking gun pointing at a lab leak. But guess what? The New York Times totally ignored that story. Instead, they breathlessly reported that the phony Wuhan seafood market study had proven a natural origin. They literally held the presses for that story, even though it was totally phony. And we haven't even gotten to 2020, when the New York Times was supposedly duped by Anderson and the others. There's this prevailing narrative that somehow we didn't know then what we know now. That is absolutely false. Yes, we now have smoking guns in the form of the Diffuse blueprint for making COVID in a lab and in the form of the private messages. We did not have those before. But the science of all this was there for everyone to see from day one. McNeil claims that the New York Times had to rely on Fauci's gang because there was no one else they could go to for a second opinion. Well, how then is it possible that random people on the internet were able to easily find those second opinions at the time? Take us, for example. We found evidence for a lab leak in plain sight. First, there was the Chinese whistleblower Xiao Baotou. While Fauci's group was colluding to cover up the truth, Xiao put out a paper explaining why the virus had come out of the Wuhan lab. He was quickly forced to take down the paper. Anyone who has even just rudimentary knowledge about China and how the CCP works would have known that he was forced to take down the paper because it was accurate. Then there's Rosanna Segreto. She's a microbiologist specializing in manipulating genomic sequences, exactly what happened here. As soon as the proximal origin paper was published online, Segreto spoke up bravely using her real name, meaning that anyone could have contacted her. In fact, we got to know Segreto because we reached out to her after reading her comments. In those comments, she explained in detail why the proximal origin paper did not show what it claimed to show. It was all there for anyone to read. There was also Yuri Dagan, a biotech entrepreneur specializing in gene therapies. He wrote an incredibly detailed article explaining why proximal origin was vacuous drivel. We could go on, but you get the point. The information was out there for anyone who bothered to look for it. Even worse, the New York Times did not even have to look for it. We have emails from Richard Ebright reaching out to the New York Times and to Donald McNeil. Ebright is the Rutgers University biologist who specifically warned about the Wuhan lab experiments even before the pandemic. Ebright's first email to the New York Times is dated February 6, 2020. That was weeks before the proximal origin paper was published. Ebright specifically told McNeil that the Wuhan experiments were done in completely inadequate safety conditions and may well have led to a lab accident. A second email from a few days later is even more specific, going through a history of problems and problematic experiments at the Wuhan lab. Ebright told the New York Times that the Wuhan experiments were like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. You can't get any more explicit than that. There's absolutely no doubt that McNeil and the New York Times knew the truth, or at least the other side of the story, but they deliberately chose not to report that information. That is a fact. No one was duped. So that leaves one more question. Why did the New York Times put all its faith into one tiny group of Fauci-funded scientists with massive conflicts of interest, which anyone could have seen from checking their funding sources? Anderson wasn't even familiar with coronaviruses. He only added that specialization to his website much later. And Holmes, who was also in the proximal group, admitted that he didn't even want to put his name on the paper because he was an amateur on the virological discussion in the paper. Those are his own words. So why did the New York Times consult these sub-mediocrities? Because only Fauci's group would tell the New York Times what they wanted to hear. That's it. That's what happened here. They deliberately sought out the people who told them the official narrative. And as for Ebright's messages and the other scientists' articles and the diffuse proposal and the private text messages, all of those things prove that it did not matter what anyone told the New York Times if it wasn't in favor of natural origin. The New York Times wouldn't have printed it anyway. They still haven't, to this day. The lesson is a simple one. Just like in Russiagate, no one was duped. Everyone knew exactly what was going on. Just like Russiagate, they all chose to report the official narrative instead of the truth. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.